My name is Irene Watson, and I am 73 years old. These days I live in a quiet little house in Oakville, Missouri, surrounded by herbs and the gentle company of neighbors who wave when they pass. You'd never guess that behind this crocheted shawl and gentle smile lives a story so dark, so unbelievable, that even now I sometimes wonder how I survived it. It was the summer of 1966, the day of my mother's funeral. I was just 13. The church was full of women in black hats and men holding handkerchiefs in their stiff palms. My father, Oliver, looked every inch the grieving widower, eyes downcast, voice low, his arm heavy around my shoulders. People whispered how strong he was, how devoted he had been to Zoe, my mother. Not one of them saw the tremor in my hands. Not one of them knew the dread rising in my chest. When the last hymn was sung and the final handshake given, my father took me by the elbow and steered me away from the crowd. We walked down a narrow hallway behind the church, past a row of closed doors, until he opened one and pushed me gently inside. It was a small Sunday school room, the kind with children's drawings tacked to the wall and a faint smell of chalk. I remember the dust motes floating in the sunlight through the blinds. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. He closed the door and leaned close. His breath smelled of whiskey and grief, and then, in a whisper so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it, he said words that froze me in place. "Now you'll be my wife too." The world tilted. My knees went weak. He wasn't crying, he wasn't trembling, he was calm, deliberate. The kind of calm that makes your stomach turn because you know danger is near. And that, my dear listeners, is where my childhood ended. But the story doesn't stop there, because the worst part wasn't what he did to me afterward. No, the deepest wound came weeks later when I discovered something hidden in his wallet, something that revealed my mother had not been his only wife at all. And what I did after finding that secret, well, let's just say it was enough to leave him shattered in a way no man ever expects. And I promise you, when you hear it, your mouth will fall open. Before I tell you how my father's whisper turned my life into a nightmare, I need you to understand where I came from, because only then will you feel the weight of what I lost. I was born in 1952 in Riverdale, Missouri, a town so small you could walk from one end to the other in less than an hour. Our house was nothing more than weathered planks on a dirt road, with a wood stove that smoked in winter and a front porch where my mother Zoe would sit with her sewing basket. She was the kind of woman everyone in town trusted, baking bread that smelled of heaven and sewing dresses that made poor girls feel like ladies. She had laughter in her voice and warmth in her hands. My father, Oliver, worked at the sawmill. People said he was a man's man. Broad shoulders, strong hands, always dressed neat for Sunday service. He laughed loud at Mr. Gerald's general store and shook hands firmly after church. He was respected, admired, even envied. Everyone in Riverdale thought Zoe had found herself a good man, and for a while, even I believed it. As a little girl, my life was simple. I'd run barefoot in the yard, climb the apple trees, and chase after my best friend Zelda down by the creek. On winter nights, we'd gather by the fire, and Father would tell stories, tales of hunting and of settlers who'd carved out life from the woods. His voice rumbled, and his gestures made me laugh. I thought he was a hero back then. But sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, I'd see the way his hand tightened on Mother's arm, or how her smile faded when he came home with the smell of whiskey on his breath. She never spoke of it, but I learned to read bruises before I learned to read books. Still, my childhood had its sweetness. The scent of my mother's collard greens simmering in a pot, the sound of hymns sung at church, the feel of sun-warmed grass under my bare legs. And through it all, my mother's voice, gentle but firm, telling me, "Irene, study hard, my girl. Education is the one thing no man can take from you." I clung to those words like a lifeline, though I didn't yet know how much I would need them. Because by the time I turned 12, our home, my safe little world, began to unravel. Mother grew pale, coughing into her handkerchief when she thought I wasn't looking. I didn't know then what it meant, but I could see the fear in her eyes. It was the first crack in the life I thought was safe, and soon the whole house of cards would collapse. I was 12 when I first noticed how quickly my mother tired. She could no longer knead dough the way she used to, her strong hands trembling as if the life was leaking out of her fingers. She would sit by the stove, coughing into a cloth she thought I didn't see, always folding it away fast. "Just a little cold, sweetheart," she'd whisper when I asked, but I wasn't blind. The coughs grew harsher, sometimes speckled with blood. The church ladies came more often then, bringing soup and casseroles, their whispers floating through the kitchen like smoke. I caught words like tuberculosis and doctor's orders. I didn't know the meaning, but I knew the sound of pity. My father acted differently too. At church he was the picture of strength, hand on my mother's back, voice solemn as he asked for prayers. But at home, when he thought no one was watching, he stared at her with something colder than grief, something I couldn't name then, but which later I would recognize as resentment. By spring of 1966, my mother was bedridden, her once rosy cheeks turned pale, her frame so thin it seemed the bedsheets might swallow her whole. I became her little nurse, fetching water, reading scripture by her side. Sometimes, when she had strength enough to talk, she'd grab my hand with surprising urgency. "Irene," she said one night, her voice hoarse, "if things ever get too hard, go to Oakville. My sister Helen will take you in." I blinked at her in surprise. I'd never even heard of this sister. Mother had always said she was an only child, but her eyes pleaded. So I nodded, not fully understanding what she was giving me. A lifeline. Just 3 weeks later, on a grey June morning, I held her hand as she took her final breath. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The house filled with neighbours preparing her wake, dressing her in her navy blue church dress, baking pies and bread, as if food could fill the hole she left behind. I sat in the corner, numb, watching the blur of black skirts and bowed heads. When the casket was lowered into the earth, I thought my heart had gone down with it. My safe harbour was gone, and for the first time I felt the chill of my father's arm around my shoulders, not as comfort, but as a warning. Because when the others left and we stood alone at her grave, he leaned down to my ear and said words that twisted my blood to ice. "Now it's just the two of us, Irene, and from now on, you'll be the woman of the house." The first week after my mother's burial was filled with casseroles, pie dishes, and sympathetic visits from neighbours. They patted my hand and said how lucky I was to still have my father, how strong Oliver was to carry on. They had no idea that every word of praise felt like a stone crushing my chest. During the day, father behaved almost like before. He went to the mill, came home for supper, and sat in his chair reading the newspaper. But at night, there was something different in his eyes. Something that made me want to bolt my bedroom door, only I didn't have a lock. One night, I cried myself to sleep, the ache of loss too heavy to bear. I must have drifted into a restless dream, because when the sound came, creak, I thought at first it was part of the nightmare, but then I opened my eyes, and the shape of him filled my doorway. "Dad!" My voice was small, trembling. He stepped inside, his shoulders looming, the smell of whiskey thick around him. He sat on the edge of my bed. His hand brushed my hair. "You've got her eyes," he whispered. "Just like your mama when she was your age." A chill shot through me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt frozen. His voice dropped lower, the words slow and heavy. "You're the woman of the house now." And then, I can't tell you every detail, even now after 60 years. Some things are branded too deep, scars that never leave. All I can say is that my childhood ended in that moment. My body was there in that bed, but my spirit fled far away, back to the apple trees, the smell of bread in the oven, my mother's laughter in the kitchen. Anywhere but there. When he was done, he left without a word, as if nothing had happened. I lay still, my cheeks wet with silent tears, staring at the ceiling until the dawn. The next morning, he drank his coffee and read the paper as though the night had been ordinary. I served his breakfast with shaking hands, my voice trapped in my throat. And I knew with a certainty that hollowed me out that this was not a one-time nightmare. It was the beginning of something that would repeat, night after night. The days blurred together after that first night. I went to school, recited lessons, even laughed when classmates told jokes. But inside, I was hollow. Every evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows crawled across the walls, dread seeped into my bones. I learned the rhythm of his footsteps, the scrape of his boots across the wooden floor. My ears could catch the faint clink of his belt buckle from across the house, Each sound was a warning, a countdown. And when the door creaked open, I disappeared into myself all over again. No one knew. Not the teachers who praised me for neat handwriting, not the neighbours who said what a dutiful daughter I was. On Sundays, I sat beside my father in church while the preacher spoke of sin and righteousness, my face a mask, my soul screaming beneath it. Sometimes, when I caught my reflection in the window, I didn't even recognise the girl staring back. She looked older than her years, her eyes dulled, her smile gone. But deep inside, a flicker of my mother's voice whispered, "If things ever get too hard, go to Oakville. My sister Helen will take you in." That memory became my secret ember of hope. I began planning little escapes in my head. I thought about running at night, slipping into the woods, following the train tracks until I reached Oakville. I even packed a small satchel once, bread, an apple, a change of clothes. But when I stepped toward the back door, the floorboard creaked, and I froze. His voice rang out from the living room. "Where you going, girl?" I stammered something about checking the chickens. He stared at me a long while before letting me pass. That night he came into my room angrier than usual, as if he'd sensed I was slipping from his grip. After that, I realized running blindly would only get me caught and punished. If I was going to leave, I had to be careful. I had to wait for the right moment. Until then, I would play the role he wanted in the daylight, the obedient daughter, the quiet housekeeper, the shadow of my mother. But at night, when I lay awake, I made silent vows to myself. One day, I will be free. One day, I will tell someone. One day, I will not be his prisoner anymore. And that promise, thin as it was, kept me alive. By the fall of 1966, the air had grown sharp with the bite of approaching winter. School had started again, and with it came whispers of homecoming dances, football games, and first crushes. My classmates giggled about lipstick shades and boys, their voices light as feathers. I smiled when expected, but I carried a weight none of them could see. At home, things were worse. My father drank more heavily, the smell of whiskey greeting me the moment I stepped through the door. His moods swung wildly, sometimes quiet, almost tender, other times bursting with rage over nothing at all. A fork placed in the wrong drawer could earn me a slap across the face, but it was the nights that hollowed me out. The footsteps, the door, the cycle, always the cycle. One night, lying in bed with my satchel hidden beneath the mattress, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. If I didn't leave soon, I feared I'd never leave at all. I waited until his snores rumbled through the thin walls. My heart pounded so hard I worried it might wake him. I slid out of bed, slipped on my shoes and eased the satchel over my shoulder. The back door groaned as I pushed it open, but the night swallowed the sound dot. The world outside was cold and vast. Crickets sang, and the moonlight stretched long across the fields. For the first time in months, I breathed without fear. I made it as far as the fence line before I heard it, his voice sharp as a whip cutting through the dark. "Irene!" My blood froze. I turned slowly, and there he stood, silhouetted in the doorway, a shadow too large to outrun. The bottle still dangled from his hand. "What you think you're doing out here?" His voice was calm, almost soft, but that was worse than yelling. That was the voice he used before the punishments. I stammered something about needing air, about missing Mama, but the satchel slipped from my shoulder and hit the ground with a dull thud. The loaf of bread rolled out into the dirt. His eyes narrowed. That night he didn't just come into my room. He dragged me by the arm so hard I thought the bone would snap. His fury was different, raw, desperate, as if he knew he might lose his grip on me. And when it was over, I lay in bed bruised and broken, staring at the ceiling, knowing two things for certain. One, running without a plan would get me caught. Two, but I had to run, or I wouldn't survive. The ember of hope my mother had left me was dim, but it wasn't gone. I clung to it harder than ever, even as my body shook with pain. Because one day, maybe not tonight, maybe not next week, but one day, I would escape him. And when I did, I would never look back. After the night he caught me at the fence, the house became a cage. He didn't trust me anymore, not even to fetch water from the well without his eyes on me. He locked the back door with a chain, kept the windows nailed shut, and even tied the barn door with heavy rope. "Don't want no thieves," he said whenever a neighbour asked. But I knew better. The thief he feared was me. At school, teachers asked why I looked tired, why my handwriting had grown shaky, why bruises bloomed on my arms. I lied easily by then. Fell in the barn. Didn't sleep good. Tripped on the steps. Lies rolled off my tongue smoother than truth. But inside I was unraveling. Nights were worse than ever. He came to me with a possessiveness that made my skin crawl. He spoke of me not as a daughter, but as a stand-in, whispering my mother's name sometimes when he touched me. It made me want to vomit. I began praying harder than I ever had in my life. Not for miracles, not even for angels, just for the strength to last one more night, one more day, until I could find a way out. One Sunday after church, I overheard the deacon's wife tell him she was sorry for our loss. "You've been so strong for Irene," she said, smiling. "She's lucky to have a father like you." I almost laughed aloud. Lucky, if only they knew. But no one did. Because I didn't tell. I couldn't. Not yet. That night, he stumbled into my room drunker than I'd ever seen him. His hands shook, his words slurred. And as he leaned over me, he muttered something that chilled me to the bone. "You'll never leave me, Irene. You're mine. You hear me? Mine." It was then I understood. He wasn't just hurting me, he was trapping me. And if I stayed, I would wither and die in that house just like Mama, only slower and with no grave of my own. That ember my mother had given me, the name Oakville, glowed brighter. I began watching, waiting, noting when he drank too much, when he passed out deep enough not to stir. I collected small scraps of information. Train schedules whispered by classmates, directions tucked away in library books. I didn't know when, but I knew this much. The next time I ran, it would be for real Dot. And nothing, not even him, would drag me back. It was February 1967, when the snow came down so heavy it buried the fence posts. The house felt like a tomb, cold, silent, and closed off from the world. My father was drinking from morning to night now. His eyes had taken on a wild, restless shine, and his words were more violent than ever. He'd started locking the front door and keeping the key in his pocket. "World's a dangerous place," he said. But I knew he wasn't afraid of strangers. He was afraid of losing control. That night, the wind howled against the windows like an animal wanting in. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my schoolwork when his boot slammed against the chair leg, rattling my pencil across the floor. "You think you're better than me now?" he slurred, swaying. "Writing your little papers like your mama used to? Think you can just run away to some fancy life?" I didn't answer. I kept my head down, my heart pounding. Then, without warning, he grabbed my books and hurled them into the fire. The papers curled and blackened, the flames eating the only pieces of myself I still owned. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed. "You're mine, always mine." Something in me snapped then. Not a loud sound, but a quiet, clean break, like a twig under snow. The fear that had kept me paralyzed for months shifted into something sharper. Not rage exactly, not even hatred, just an absolute certainty. If I stayed one more night, I would never leave this house alive. That certainty burned away my hesitation. It burned so hot it felt like a heartbeat in my throat. When he finally stumbled to his room and collapsed onto the bed, the bottle rolling out of his hand, I sat in the dark kitchen and waited. I watched the clock tick past midnight. I listened to his snores deepen into the kind of drunk sleep no noise could break. Then I stood. My hands didn't tremble this time. I moved quickly, silently. I pulled on my boots, tucked the satchel under my arm, the same one I'd packed and unpacked 100 times. Bread, an apple, the scrap of paper with the name Oakville scrawled across it. I took a last look at the house, the stove where Mama had cooked, the stairs where I used to sit with my doll, the walls that had heard every secret. And then I turned my back on it. I slipped out the door into the snow. The cold slapped my cheeks, but it felt like freedom. The night was deep and wide, the sky full of stars. This time I didn't hesitate at the fence. I climbed over, dropped into the drift on the other side, and started running. Running toward Oakville, running toward life, running away from him. And for the first time in months, the voice inside me wasn't my father's, it was my mother's. "Go, Irene! Run!" The snow was deep, but adrenaline pushed me forward. My boots crunched against the frozen earth as I made my way toward the train tracks. Oakville was 15 miles east. Far for a child, but not impossible. Not with freedom burning in my chest. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see his silhouette charging after me, lantern in hand. At first there was nothing but the quiet hush of snow and the distant call of an owl. Then, just as I reached the tracks, the sound split the night. The slam of a door, the faint echo of a man's voice calling my name. "Irene!" My stomach twisted. He was awake. He knew Dot. The voice grew louder, carried by the wind. I ducked low, crawling beneath the skeleton branches of a hedgerow. My teeth chattered, not just from cold, but from terror. I heard him stumbling in the snow, cursing, shouting my name again and again. For a moment, the night felt like it had collapsed. The freedom I'd tasted only minutes ago now slipping through my fingers. Dot. But then, silence. No footsteps. No voice, only the wind. I waited, heart hammering, until my legs cramped from crouching. Then I forced myself to move again, keeping low, every sound magnified in the frozen air. By dawn, my clothes were soaked through, and my lips were cracked with cold. But ahead, through the pale morning light, I saw the outline of a train station. Oakville. The town looked like salvation painted in white frost. Smoke curled from chimneys. Children in heavy coats trudged towards school, and for the first time in a year, I breathed without fear. I stumbled down the street, asking anyone who'd listen where I might find Helen, my mother's sister. An old woman pointed me toward a small blue house at the edge of town. My legs nearly gave out as I climbed the porch steps and knocked on the door. It opened, and a woman with my mother's eyes stood there, older, sterner, but undeniably kin. "Irene," she whispered, her face softening as if she'd been waiting for me all her life. The moment I crossed that threshold, my body collapsed. For the first time in months, I was safe. But as she held me in her arms, one truth echoed in my mind. Safe did not mean free, because somewhere out there, my father still lived. And I knew he would never stop looking for me. For a few precious weeks, Oakville was a sanctuary. Aunt Helen fed me warm stews, tucked me into clean sheets, and never once pressed me for details. She seemed to know that some wounds were too raw to touch. At night, I still woke trembling, ears straining for footsteps in the hallway. But instead of my father's shadow, it was only the creak of Aunt Helen's old floorboards. Slowly, I began to breathe again. But peace never lasts long when a monster still walks free. One grey afternoon, as I was helping Helen hang laundry, the crunch of tyres on gravel made my stomach twist. A truck pulled into the drive. His truck. Rusted red, dented fender, the one I'd prayed never to see again. My father stepped out, his face pale from the cold but burning with rage. "Irene!" he barked, his eyes cutting straight to me. "Get your things. You're coming home." My knees shook, but Helen stepped forward, planting herself between us. "She's not going anywhere, Oliver," she said firmly. "She's staying here, with me." His jaw tightened. "She's my daughter. She's my niece, and I'll protect her." For a moment, I thought he might strike her the way he struck me, his fists clenched, his boots crunching in the snow as he moved closer. But then something shifted. Helen didn't back down. She stared at him with a fire that reminded me of my mother. And behind her, I realized the neighbors had begun to gather, watching from their porches, eyes narrowed. For the first time, he was exposed, his mask of respectability cracking under the weight of their suspicion. He muttered a curse, spat in the snow, and stormed back to his truck. The engine roared, the tires spun, and then he was gone. I stood frozen, heart pounding, until Helen took my hand. "He won't touch you again," she said. "Not while I'm here." And for the first time I almost believed it. Dot still calmer as night fell. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, knowing that though he'd left Oakville, his shadow would always follow me. But I also knew something stronger now. I wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to finally break his hold. The first weeks after my father's departure were filled with a strange mix of relief and fear. Each morning, I woke to the sound of birds instead of his voice, sunlight spilling across Aunt Helen's kitchen instead of shadows crawling along my bedroom walls. It was freedom, yes, but freedom tasted bitter, because the memories were still there, lurking in every corner. Helen never forced me to speak about what had happened. Instead, she let me work alongside her in her garden, teaching me to plant marigolds, tomatoes, and herbs. Soil under my fingernails felt like a quiet rebellion, a small reclaiming of power that no one could take from me. School became a refuge too. Miss Jenkins, the principal, noticed the change in me. "You've got fire in your eyes, Irene," she said, handing me a fresh notebook. "Don't let anyone dim it." For the first time, a teacher's words weren't just encouragement. They were a lifeline. I began writing, longhand, in a diary Aunt Helen had found tucked in an old drawer. I wrote about fear, about loss, about the twisted love of a man who called himself my father. I wrote about hope, too, the kind of hope that rises slowly, like spring thawing a frozen creek. Neighbours brought meals and small gifts. A pair of mittens knitted by Mrs. Caldwell from down the street. Freshly baked bread from the bakery where Aunt Helen used to buy her weekly loaf. Each gesture reminded me that the world wasn't entirely cruel. There were good people, people who could be trusted, people who could be family even when blood was absent. I began to imagine a future, one that belonged to me, a small home of my own, a garden filled with herbs and flowers, a life where I could wake up without trembling, without fear of hands meant to protect instead violating. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the anger inside me began to soften into clarity. I realized that survival was only the first step. Living, truly living, would require courage I didn't yet know I had. But every day, step by step, I felt stronger. And in that strength I began to sense something else. A fire not for revenge, not for hatred, but for justice. One day I would make sure the truth about him, about my father, could no longer hide in the shadows. For now, though, I simply breathed. The snow had melted, the frost receding, and so too, bit by bit, was the hold he had on me. I was still Irene Watson. I was still alive, and that, after all I had endured, was everything. Years passed, and Oakville became my home in every sense. I stayed with Aunt Helen through my teenage years, learning trades my mother had once taught me. Sewing, cooking, tending a garden. But this time, the lessons carried a different weight. They were tools, not chains. Ways to build a life I could truly call my own. I finished school and found work at a small bakery downtown. The smell of bread and fresh pastries reminded me of my mother. Each loaf I kneaded, each pie I baked, was a small act of reclaiming joy, of shaping the world with my own hands rather than letting fear shape me. The nightmares didn't vanish overnight, but I learned to control them. I built routines, friends, and a quiet independence. I made a pact with myself. I would never again be a shadow in someone else's house. I would own my body, my mind, my destiny. By my early 20s, I moved into a modest house at the edge of Oakville. It had a small yard, perfect for a garden. Rosemary, mint, sage, lavender. My mother's herbs, Aunt Helen's wisdom, and my own stubborn love for life grew there together. I felt my mother with me in every sprig, every leaf. It was during this time I finally confronted the legal reality of my father. Though he had left Oakville, his past wasn't erased. I discovered the double marriage he had kept secret, the other children, the lies. I reported everything to the authorities quietly, ensuring the truth of his crimes. Bigamy, abuse, neglect could not be hidden. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it to reclaim my story, to give voice to every child he had hurt, and to make sure the shadow of his control ended. The authorities took months, but eventually he faced consequences he had long evaded. I never attended the trial. I didn't need to. My victory wasn't in witnessing his fall. It was in walking into the courtroom every day of my life, free, unafraid, and alive. And life, finally, allowed me to breathe. By my 30s, I had built a small but thriving herbal business. Locals came for my teas, salves, and remedies. Children came to learn gardening. I laughed again, cried again, and fell in love with life the way I should have at 13, 17, or 20. Every morning I stepped into my garden, cupping my hands around the fragrant leaves, feeling the sunlight warm my face, knowing I had survived what most never could. And though the memory of my father's shadow lingered, it no longer controlled me. Irene Watson, orphan, survivor, healer, finally owned her story. Now, at 73, I sit on the porch of my little home in Oakville, the same porch where I taught myself to breathe freely after years of fear. The morning sun glows softly on my garden, and the herbs, rosemary, mint, lemon balm, rue, basil, wave gently in the breeze. I often think about the girl I once was, frozen with fear under the shadow of a man who should have protected her. That girl, trembling in the night, hiding from someone she called father, would never have believed she could survive, let alone thrive. And yet here I am. I tend my garden with hands that have known grief, loss and betrayal, but also love, joy and resilience. I teach the younger women in town about each plant, each remedy, the magic of life restored. Every lesson I share is a whisper to that scared girl inside me. You are more than your pain. You are alive. You are free. Some days I walk to the edge of Oakville and look toward Riverdale. The memories come unbidden. The dirt roads, the casket lowered into the ground, the smell of pine from the sawmill, the grip of my father's hands when they shouldn't have touched me. I do not tremble anymore. I do not cry for revenge. I cry for the lost innocence, for the child who deserved protection but found her strength instead. Justice, I've learned, does not always come from the law. Sometimes it comes from survival. Sometimes it comes from taking back your story, planting roots in a new place, growing stronger than the storm that tried to break you. I've had love since then, quiet, patient, respectful love that did not demand submission or fear. I've had friendships that healed old wounds, and though my mother is gone, her voice guides me still. The recipes, the garden tips, the gentle admonitions to be strong, to stand tall, to protect myself. Life has a way of turning tragedy into resilience, grief into wisdom, and fear into courage. I am living proof. And yet as I sip my morning tea, watching the wind dance through the herbs, I know one thing for certain. The girl I once was, trembling in Riverdale, could never have imagined this moment. But the woman she became, she knew it was possible. The past will always whisper, but the present and the future is mine. Even in my 70s, I sometimes think back to that night with the condom, the acid, the tiny needle. A small, desperate act by a frightened girl. But it was the first time I realized I could fight back, that I could assert power over a man who thought he could control me. That act stayed with me, a seed of cunning, of subtle rebellion that grew stronger as I did. It taught me that intelligence and courage could turn fear into action, and I never forgot it. Years later, when my father's bigamy and abuses were revealed, it wasn't a courtroom battle that delivered satisfaction. It was the knowledge that every deceitful move he had made, every lie he had told, had been quietly undermined by me. He had spent decades believing he was untouchable, manipulating those around him. But one tiny act, born out of desperation and fear, had started a chain reaction he could not stop. He never knew the true extent of my awareness, my vigilance, my quiet planning. By the time the authorities pieced together his lies, I had already built a life far removed from his reach, a life full of love, trust, and respect. The woman he tried to break had become a force that no man, no matter how powerful in his own mind, could contain. I smile when I think about it, not out of cruelty, but because justice came in a way he never anticipated. Not through vengeance, not through anger, but through my survival, my intelligence, and my refusal to be defined by his cruelty. Now, as I walk through my herb garden, tending rosemary and basil, I feel the sweetness of freedom in every leaf. The past is a shadow, yes, but it is a shadow that taught me how to shine. I am Irene Watson, survivor, healer, gardener, woman unbroken. And to anyone watching this, remember, even in the darkest storm, strength can grow in the smallest corners. Courage begins with a single act, and life can be beautiful, even after unimaginable pain. It's a crisp autumn morning in Oakville, and I'm sitting on the same porch where I've spent countless hours reflecting, tending my herbs, and watching the world go by. The leaves blaze in gold and crimson, drifting down like tiny memories settling gently to the ground. I hear laughter from the street, children playing hopscotch, echoing the days of my childhood, the innocence I thought I'd lost forever. I smile, realizing that life has a strange way of completing the circle. The girl I was, terrified and trapped, now witnesses joy without fear. Today, a package arrives at my doorstep. Inside is a photo album, fragile with age. As I flip through it, I see images of my father with his other family, images I never sought, but somehow ended up in my hands. The shock is still there, but now it carries no fear, no anger, only confirmation of a truth I've long owned. His power over me ended decades ago. And then, tucked into the back of the album, I find a letter. My father wrote it before his death, a confessional note never sent, never meant to be seen by anyone but the universe. He writes of guilt, shame, and regret, words I never needed for closure, because I found that in myself long ago. But reading them now, I feel a strange compassion, a recognition that even monsters are human, though they may never change. I close the letter and place it on the table beside me, turning my gaze to the garden. The herbs sway in the wind, each leaf a reminder of life reclaimed. Rosemary for memory, mint for courage, lemon balm for healing, rue for protection, all gifts of the past that have shaped my present. A knock interrupts my thoughts. It's a young woman from the community holding a basket of tomatoes. She looks at me with wide eyes. "Mrs. Watson, I just wanted to thank you for teaching me about the herbs. You've changed my life, and you've changed mine." For the first time, I feel the full weight of everything I've survived. The grief, the fear, the betrayal, transforming into something enduring and beautiful. My story is no longer one of victimhood. It is a testament to survival, cunning, resilience, and the quiet, unyielding power of a determined woman. As the sun sets, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and violet, I sit back in my rocking chair, a warm shawl around my shoulders. I close my eyes and feel the wind brush my face, the same wind that carried me through fear, loss, and pain so many decades ago. You are free, you are strong, you are unstoppable. And in that moment I realize something profound. The past may have shaped me, but it does not define me. My life, full of love, strength, and purpose, is mine. I am Irene Watson, survivor, healer, woman unbroken, and now, finally at last, I am at peace.